Welcome to the 320 Podcast, where we encourage you to reach for the immeasurably more life with Christ. From discussions on Scripture, to poetic messages, to dreaming big with Jesus, you will enjoy a variety of episodes brought to you by Shelly Wilson Ministries. To find out more about Shelly Wilson Ministries and the many resources available to you, please visit our website at www.shellywilsonministries.org.
Lisa Fleck. Let me introduce you. You've been on here before, so it's not like you're a stranger to those who are listening. But in the past, when you came, it was part of New Creation and the ministry, and we talked about healing from y'all's perspective, from our perspective. But, you know, I've had it on my mind to just sit down and share because Greg has already, your husband Greg, for those who are listening, Greg Fleck, so they run New Creation Foundation here in Troup, Texas. He ended up in the hospital with COVID. Right. And so his side of that story has been told on Jessica Gunter's podcast, Walking Each Other Home. But I always knew that I wanted to share your side, your perspective, because I kind of had the privilege of walking that one with you.
Yeah. Girl.
Right.
The whole time I thought, I'm going to wear this woman out.
No.
My friendship out with her. I'm calling her all the time.
No. It was but for me, it was like an honor. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a burden at all. But I remember, and I was thinking about this earlier, hoping that I could remember things that we both could. I remember getting the call from David. Yeah. Saying, Shelly, can you come? Girl, I was packing my stuff before he even said. Like, I knew I needed to go. So I remember coming into the building. I remember exactly where you were sitting in that middle room outside the offices. Mm-hmm. I remember not knowing what to say. And all I remember, and I'm sure we had conversation, but I just remember starting praying in the Spirit. Then we were so loud all of a sudden. Yeah. It was like war.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was.
Absolute war. And I remember feeling that war in my belly, the fire of the war, the battle, feeling like the Lord was showing me and the room, because David and we were all three in there, that this was a battle, a spiritual battle. Yeah. And I remember later David telling us that the guys down the hallway heard it and felt something break.
Oh,
do you remember that?
I don't even remember that.
I think I'm saying that right. I hope I'm not telling a story, but I'm almost positive that's what he said. Because I remember we were really loud. Yeah. It was an all-out war. Yeah. Almost angry. Right. Not at God, but that the devil had come in that way.
The audacity.
Exactly. So, and just for people listening, this is a tender place for you, because you had COVID too. Yeah. You know, and so here you were trying to recover yourself. Mm-hmm. So, do you remember your thoughts that day? Like, I knew you were about to make a tough decision. That's the first thing I remember. Yeah. Do you remember what went through your mind that day?
Well, they were asking me permission to intubate him. Because he was not in a position to do it anymore. He couldn't even hardly think. He doesn't even recollect the phone call I had with him.
On the FaceTime? And I was sitting right next to you during that.
He does not remember that phone call. And I said, baby, you weren't getting any oxygen. You don't remember any of that. But they were asking me permission to intubate him. And my only thought was, this is the last time I'm going to talk to him. My husband's going to die. Mm-hmm. And that was all I could see. Because everybody else that I had known of had died.
Yeah.
And So it was unreal. It was surreal. It was like, this is not happening. How could this be
Right,
happening?
like a dream.
You know, it was because he had already been in the hospital like 2 weeks, I think, and you know he had started getting better,
Yeah.
and then just all of a sudden he just took a turn. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so but I remember when, because I had gotten the phone call from the doctor that they were wanting to do this, and I was sitting outside David's office. He was listening to the phone conversation, and I hung up and I looked at him and he said, "Is there somebody I can call?" And at the same time I thought it, he said it, "Can I call Shelly?"
No.
Because that was my thought. I was going to have him call you.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you and I have known each other for several years, but we've just known each other in passing.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I would drop off gifts for
Yeah.
for y'all,
Yeah.
or
But there was something God was planning there.
yeah,
You know.
from the day
Mm-hmm.
we started in this building.
Yeah.
It began.
It began.
I can't say. I mean, I think I knew something was happening, but I couldn't think about it because I knew I had to get the building up.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost like I was adopted into a new family immediately.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
Yeah.
when the guys came and
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Cliff, which I've shared on a past podcast, but even today I feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so, and I remember that FaceTime call, and you know what I remember? I remember thinking, God has this. In that moment, I remember thinking of God was upholding you, although you probably didn't feel it in the moment. But you were on the phone with him 100% trying to hold your composure.
Yeah.
Because you were worried about him being afraid.
Yes.
And you didn't want him to see you were afraid.
Right.
And I remember just taking my hand, and I think I was patting your knee the whole time.
I think so. I do remember that.
I mean, I was just like, it's
Yeah.
going to be okay. And but I was amazed because Lisa, it wasn't a long phone call, but it must have felt like eternity to you.
Mm-hmm.
And when you hit that end button, that's when you really started crying. And, you know, that was the one place y'all didn't want to go, was the vent. I remember that was like a big discussion, right?
Right. It was. Yeah, because that was his, from the time he went into the hospital, he always told them, because they would say, you need to sleep. He's like, I can't sleep. Why can't you sleep? He said, because you're going to do something while I'm asleep. And they're like, no, we won't ever do that. You know, we'll get your permission. And like I said, he does not remember giving them permission. You know, even to this day, you know. And I said, no, baby. I said, you said that you were okay with this because you were tired. And I said, and they did this on the phone. I'm sure they did it as me being a witness to.
Right.
You know, we've told him this is what's going to happen, you know, but he doesn't remember. You know.
Yeah. No, I remember some details. I remember you call him Precious.
Mm-hmm.
That is so stuck to me, this whole, because he was in the hospital how long?
He had, at that time, that was his 20th day.
Okay.
In the hospital.
And he was in a makeshift room, correct? Am I wrong about that?
He was in he was in a floor of the heart hospital, which had always been just heart patients. And they had so many patients that they had to turn this floor into strictly a COVID floor.
So you weren't able to stay with him. I was
able to see him for 10 minutes a day through a glass through a window. So there was I couldn't touch it.
Because that was in the time where it was really shut down there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they wouldn't let me in. I came with you one day.
They wouldn't even let you in the building.
Wouldn't even let me be in the building, yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was really in the throes of the COVID
Yeah.
lockdown.
So I wasn't able to get in the room with him until after they had intubated him.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I'm like, you know, I could mask up and gown up just like y'all.
Right.
So I've had COVID, you know. But,
right.
I mean, that was their protocol at the time. You know?
Yeah. And were you on any meds for the COVID, or you were just recovering at home? I can't remember.
No, I've never taken anything.
Okay.
I mean, I was sick for about.
I remember
5
you
or
were
6
real
days.
tired.
I was pretty sick. I lost 25 pounds in 5 days. How do you even do that?
Right.
You know, how
Right.
do you even lose that kind of weight in 5 days?
Well.
But yeah, I had just been because I was texting him. You know, we would talk every now and then because he obviously was, you know, having a hard time breathing. You know, even
Yeah.
then. And I was sick, and so we would just talk once a day. But I had to wait 2 full weeks before I could even go see him after I was over my symptoms.
Right.
You know? So I had only just started going to see him.
Yeah.
Maybe a half a week.
Yeah.
And it wasn't very long.
Yeah. I remember we would pray on the phone a lot.
Yeah.
Remember you would send specific prayer requests.
Yeah.
And that's kind of some of those things I wanted to talk about, because there became a real clear moment where God was still heavily involved. He was speaking to you.
Yes. Like never in
Right.
my life
Right.
had he spoke to me like that.
Do you remember any specifics?
Oh.
Because during this whole time, too, part of it, from a warfare standpoint, was you had to stand up to the medical team on several occasions. But God had prepared you. I remember you were given a dream about a cloaked person,
Yes.
right? And so the Lord had prepared you for something that ended up coming. You weren't the only one who was given dreams to. I had a dream. David had a dream. So God was confirming so many things.
Vocal.
Yeah.
He was very vocal. I mean, the first thing I remember was the day after. Because I went home that night. David's wife came over for a little while and spent several hours with me. And she went home, and I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to go to bed. I'm exhausted.
Right.
I'm just going to go to bed. I could never sleep in our room, though. I always had to sleep in the guest bedroom.
Yeah.
I just, I don't know. It was weird. I could go to sleep back there. And so I went to sleep, and I got up the next morning, and you know, it was just it was just going through the motion.
Yeah.
You know, the routine. You know, and I was doing things, and wasn't focused on anything I was doing. It was just you know, going through the motions. And so that morning, we met in the chapel for prayer. And there was just, the presence of the Lord was so sweet in that place. And it wasn't anything profound. We prayed. They prayed for Greg and prayed for me. And everybody left and went to the office. And I just kept sitting there because I felt safe.
Yeah.
And I sat in the back of the chapel, and I couldn't get up. I really wasn't praying. I felt like I was in a safe place. I wasn't hurting. I wasn't scared.
Yeah.
I wasn't, you know, crying or anything. And all of a sudden, the Lord showed me Greg and I as 2 vessels that had been crushed to powder.
Yeah.
I mean,
I remember that
there was no
now.
form, no nothing. It was 2 piles of crushed vessels, and they were kind of overlapping. And in my mind, I tried to separate them. No, this is his vessel. This is my vessel. And it would literally come back together, one on top of the other. And I'm like, well, that didn't make any sense. But the Lord showed me. He said, I'm going to remake you.
Yeah.
I'm going to remake both of you, but I can't remake one without the other. That was my the first thing he had told me where I knew Greg was going to survive.
Yeah.
Is because if you can't make me without him,
Right.
and you say you're going to remake him, and you can't do it without me, then he's obviously going to survive.
Yeah.
You know, And that got throughout this entire process, when something devastating would happen, God didn't leave me in that place very long.
Right. Right.
It might be overnight,
Mm-hmm.
it might be through the day, but within 24 hours, he had either spoken to me directly,
Mm-hmm.
or through his word, or through someone else,
Mm-hmm.
and bring me back up out of that pit I had just sunk into.
Absolutely. Now, didn't Greg's, I don't remember at what part of the process this was, or how many weeks in this was. Didn't a family relative of his send you a message? Confirmation of something.
It was toward the end.
Was it towards the end? Okay.
Well, it wasn't toward the end, but it was a good month in, where she said that it was his cousin,
That's right.
that she had seen him running.
Mm.
Yeah, because this was deep into it, because he had the bed sores
Right,
and all that kind of
right.
stuff. So this was pretty deep into his being in the hospital when all that happens. She said, I saw him. She said I actually saw him walking up my sidewalk. She said, you and he together were coming to my house for Thanksgiving. And she said he was obviously skinny, she said, because he was pulling his pants up. But she said there was no wounds, and he wasn't having any difficulty breathing. See, that was another thing, is they kept telling me in the hospital he may be on oxygen the rest of his life. And I had other people saying, well, he may be on oxygen the rest of his life. And I was like, and I remember saying this to one person, and it came out kind of forcefully, because I was like, oh my gosh, I hope I didn't offend them. They said, well, he may be on, that it's going to scar his lungs. I said, oh no, it's not. I said, because God's going to heal him completely. And to this day, when he goes to a doctor or a nurse and they listen to his lungs, they look at him and say, you had COVID? And he goes, yeah. Well, how bad did you have it? He's, well, I was in the hospital for 2 months with it. And they're like, you have no sound at all in your lungs that you ever had COVID.
Wow.
God did completely heal.
He did completely heal. I do distinctly remember. I think so. This is the funny part of the remaking. I think with you is you're a very mild-mannered, quiet, by nature person. Although she's a mighty prayer and all that good stuff, and can tear some stuff down.
But I don't like confrontation.
But you
with
don't,
people.
right?
Yeah.
So by nature, but something, God rose, the Lion of Judah stood up in you, because I remember you telling me that you told some of the medical staff that to quit saying everything negative in the room or don't come in.
Yeah.
Something to that effect.
Yeah.
You really turned everybody around. I'm not going to listen to that. It's not going to be said around him where he can hear it. I don't want to hear it. You pretty much rejected the report and stood on what God was telling you behind the scenes.
And that meeting with that physician was after he had been intubated for almost 2 months,
Okay.
about a month and a half. And I was supposed to have met, because it was just one of those things. I was beside myself again. I'm like, this, stuff's not happening. He had been put in they had moved him out of that floor where he had been into an old ICU unit where they had moved all the COVID patients. And it's like the progress in what they had said they were going to do just stopped for 10 days.
I remember
Nothing was
that.
happening.
Yeah.
And so, and I was just, I called my friends. I had 2 friends. One works for the hospital, one works with the hospital. And they both called the same unit director. Didn't even know this. He called a meeting with the physician. That was the physician, I called it the physician of the week, because every week he had a different physician, which left no continuity in his care, because it was every
Right.
week changed, So anyway, it was going to be the physician of the week, the unit director, and I think the charge nurse that was that week. And so I got in there for that day. It was going to be during my visitation time, and we got in there, and the physician that was there was the very first physician that told me I needed to decide whether I was going to allow him basically to live.
Mm-hmm.
You know, are you, you really gonna, you need to decide what is best for him, not best for you. And I'm like, are you talking about end of life? And she said, yes. I'm like, oh no. Oh no, we're not talking about ending his life. You know. So anyway, when I ended up with this meeting, it was her that was there. Well, she was the chief of all the critical care doctors.
Mm.
And she happened to be there that day. I said, oh, you're back his physician this week? She says, no, just today. I'm just filling in for a friend, is what she said. Well, she was the one that came to this meeting. And that's when I said, look, I said, the way that y'all are, I said, everybody that has family members in here understands that this is an hour to hour, sometimes, situation.
Yeah.
They could be real good 1 minute, and in the next hour they could be crater. And we all understand this. This is not new to us. If they've been in the hospital any length of time, we know that things change. But I said, when I call and I say, how is he doing? And you say, well, he's doing really good right now. And I said, and that's how it's being said. It's not being said, oh, he's doing really good right now. So did you see the difference?
Yeah.
I said, the way you're putting that hook on the end of that phrase, I said, you're stealing the hope. And for me, and I said, you're not giving him or any of these other patients any hope when you walk in there, because you're not talking to them.
Yeah.
You're going in there and doing your thing.
Yeah, that was a big
walking
thing for
out.
him.
I said, we're the only ones that are giving our family members any hope. And when you steal it from me, I have nothing to give.
Yeah.
And she didn't cry, but I could see tears welling up in her eyes, and I was like, and I was like, you've got to allow me to have hope to give to him.
Yeah.
And I said, and I'll tell you this right now, I said, I'm not going to try to convince you that this is the truth, but I said, as sure as I'm sitting here, I said, my husband's going to live, and you need to begin to treat him like he's going to live.
Right.
Not like he's going to die. And I said, you need to begin to treat all the rest of these patients like they're going to live. I said, my husband's name is Fleck. He's my husband. He's a grandfather. He has 2 grandchildren. He's the head of a ministry. He is not patient number 247.
Oh, I remember saying to you something of the effect, I don't know if I'll get it right, Lisa, maybe God has set you in that place to change things. Yeah. And you were seeing that. Like he was opening doors. Because, again, not your nature. Yeah, this isn't your nature. No, it's not you're not normally going to be that patient or that patient's wife that speaks up. But you were in this situation.
Well, and I remember you saying, Lisa, maybe God had her in that place today because she has the influence over the entire department.
Yeah.
And until you said that, I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, because you're right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
It's hard to see when you're that close, right?
Right.
I'm just listening from afar, kind of. Yeah, that I remember that, and that lasted a while. Like you had several battles in that arena. It's not like it was just one and done.
Right. No.
You know.
Yeah. It was when he was in that particular.
You
area.
fired some people.
I did, yeah.
Okay.
She
totally fired.
And because that was the second meeting that I had with the officials of, because I had a meeting in that first hospital he was in, I had a meeting with them. You know, and that, it's unfortunate to say, but sometimes when you come across like that, you're really treading on risky territory because I couldn't be with him, so I didn't know what was happening if they were mad at me.
Right.
Right. I mean, it was.
And it was a season of stress on medical staff.
Yeah.
Stress.
They were.
Yeah.
Because when Greg was doing the interview, before he, when she was coming at it from the medical
Jessica,
perspective,
yeah.
she was like, we were all scared. And I was like, yeah, you're right. I'm sure they were, because they only knew what they were being told.
Right.
And so, and coming into this, I only knew what they were telling me.
Right.
I didn't have any experience.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing: is God had placed around me warriors like you, and everybody that we work with, David,
yes,
and Jennifer and Bobby, that were holding me up in prayer.
Right.
But not only that, but He had placed so many medical professionals in my path. Two of they're not my technically stepdaughters, but but I consider them, my stepdaughters. Yeah. They're both nurses.
Wow.
They both had experience in this. They had both seen it. One of them, and I had given them permission to call and get information, because they would call me and say, well, this and this and this, and give me numbers. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So when they would get it, when Natalie or Nicole would get it, they could say, okay, this is what this means, And then I had a neighbor that they had moved away, but she was also a nurse and had come back to work at the same hospital in a COVID unit. So she was kind of new to the procedures, but she would send me pages of text messages saying, okay, Lisa, this is what's going on.
That, yeah.
This is how it's going to happen, because she was getting information from her supervisor saying, okay, my friend's husband's in the hospital and this is what's happening. Can you explain it to me so I can explain it to her? So, I got this vast amount of knowledge that most people did not have.
Right. Right. And I remember, and I don't recall why this happened. Maybe you remember. And even I can almost see it in my mind's eye of you doing this. There was someone on the staff that you began to tell of another man, a friend of y'all's, who had come off the vent out of was another pastor.
Yeah.
Right.
It wasn't even anybody I know. It's somebody that from, close by, Ark.
Okay, and you used that as an example. What do you remember that situation?
I do, because I had gone in that day. He was still in the original hospital, original floor, and they kept wanting me to do the trach. And for whatever reason, for that period of time, and I may not ever know until I stand before the Lord and He explains it to me. But He was very specific at that period of time when they wanted to trach him to not do that. I mean, because I had already given them permission to do it. And the Lord says, don't do it. They want to the enemy wants to steal his voice. And so I called him and said, no. Well, of course, every time I walked into the hospital after that, they were on me. You need to do this. You need to do this. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do it. No, I'm not going to do it. And so this one day, this nurse was talking to me about it. And there was another nurse that was walking down the hall right about the time we were having this conversation. I said, look, there was a gentleman that was just released from the hospital like the last couple of months. I said, he's a pastor of church. Or has been a pastor of a church. I said he was intubated 158 days, I believe. That's what it was. It was 128 or 158 days. And I said, and they extubated him. And I said, and from all reports, he's doing fine. And so she started arguing with me. Well, he was trached, and this nurse that was walking past, she said, oh no, he wasn't. She said, that was an ET tube. She said he was on an ET tube the entire time. She said, I was his nurse several times.
Look at God.
Yeah. And the nurse looked at her. She said, it wasn't a trach. She says, no, it was an ET tube. And she said, they extubated him. And she said, yeah, from what I've heard, he's doing great. She said he lost a lot of weight. He said he was a fairly large fellow when he came in. He said, of course, he lost a lot of weight. But, and so from then on, I hung on to that. It's like, hey, God, you did it once. You can do it again. Now, later on down the road, he had a doctor that, for whatever reason, I had no trust in any of these doctors after, a couple of them, started really hounding me about turning him off. And so he had this one doctor this one day, and he started talking to me about it. He said, "Mrs. Fleck," he said, "I cannot extubate him in the condition that he's in. He is so weak."
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "But I'm going to get him off of all the sedation." Because he had been sedated for, oh my gosh, 6 weeks, totally out, this whole time. And so, and I said, okay, and the next day I come in and all the IVs are turned off. They had tried to lower his sedation and past times, and his heart rate would shoot up, and his respiration.
I remember that.
His oxygen level would just, go away and all this. And so I walked in the next morning, and all the machines were turned off. And he walked down the hall and said, "How in the world?" He says, "I don't know. Sometimes it works." Well, I had put a prayer request out, and and I said, "I know how it happened,
Yeah.
But because of that, there was, God allowed me to trust this man, and so I said, well, let's give it a couple of days. Let's see what he does off of all this sedation, and see how much he wakes up and how much movement there is. And so I watched it for several days, and he didn't. He was just so weak, because they were just keeping him alive with that, that feed that was going on. And so that was about the time I called him and I said, "Look, okay, I'm ready to do it." Because I called all kinds of people. I'm like, "Look, I know the Lord told me not to do this, but I said, now I'm faced with this."
I remember you wrestling with, do I now? It was almost like you were like, do I have permission now?
Right, yeah.
But he did give you the peace.
He did give
when
me
it
the
was the
peace
right
to
time. Yeah.
And so when I finally got a hold of him, because I was trying to get a hold of him before his tour of being Greg's doctor ended,
right,
which was going to be like on Sunday. And when I called him, he says, "Oh, I'm not his doctor anymore." I'm like, "What?" He said, "No, I've gotten moved and this."
But I hear you say that now, and I'm like, the Lord put him in place so you could have the peace and the trust just long enough to get the trach. Because I remember asking Jessica about it, and I can't remember if I ever told you, because I didn't want to confuse you, but I remember her telling me the trach is a good thing. And I remember telling her she feels like she heard from the Lord, not going to do that. Yeah. And I can't remember the amount of days that went by during all that, but God was clearly speaking to you. There was no doubt to me when we were praying specifically for things. I mean, I remember one prayer request, and I can't remember if this is about the time I got a dream, which is not my normal to dream on behalf of others. You asked for us to pray for him to have the will to live. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do, because...
Did something happen around that time? I remember because we had the prayer room in here during that time, and the ladies were fully invested. They had not met him, but they were intimately involved in prayer, during this whole time. And I remember that was a specific prayer request we went after one night.
And I think it was the part that
maybe he took a turn a little bit worse or something, and I don't know if the Lord told you to pray for his will to live. I can't remember that.
I think that happened after they had moved him to that old ICU unit, that he just seemed to be failing. And every time I would go in, the sedation was turned up, because they would try to, every time they tried to decrease it, even just a few micrograms, his heart rate would come up.
Yeah, I remember that.
His respiration would go down, and it was almost like he didn't want to wake up. And the Lord had taken me to a scripture, which I didn't bring my Bible in here, but it was the desire, something about the desire
That's
to
right.
live. It's in Psalms,
Yeah.
the desire. And so I put the word out, pray that he has the desire to live. And I remember walking in there one day, and he had been on this sedation for such a long time that, you know, I'm sure his body was kind of building up a resistance,
Right.
because where he was at, the level he had, he should have been totally out.
Right.
And I walked in one day, and his eyes were open. But, you know, Greg's got blue eyes. Is what I first fell in love with when I met him when I was 16 years old, was those beautiful blue eyes. And he opened his eyes, and his eyes were as gray as your sweater.
Mm.
There was no color in his eyes. And I remember sitting there going, why is there no color in his eyes?
Mm.
And I don't know anything about death,
Mm-hmm.
but I read somewhere one time, whether it's true or not, that is kind of a precursor,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so, but I remember looking at his eyes when he was awake and saying, I need you to come home.
Oh, I totally remember you doing that.
I need you to gather all the strength you have,
Mm-hmm.
because I need you,
Mm-hmm.
and I need you to come home.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, do you understand me? I said, blink your eyes if you understand. And he opened and closed his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Because listening to his side of the podcast with Jessica, he was worried about being a burden to you, being in the hospital and all that.
Yeah.
So it's funny how the Lord. Do you think it was this? I was looking up the scripture. Do you think it was this verse, Proverbs 18? Your will to live can sustain you when you are sick, but if you lose it, your last hope is gone.
It may have been.
May have been that one.
May have been that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to say, maybe I got the dream shortly. Well, I don't know. I remember.
I think it was around that time.
I do too, because now that I look back at the dream, and I have it written down, I want to share it so they can learn God still speaks through dreams.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of this was speaking to the answer prayer for his desire to live. Now that I look back at the dream,
Yeah.
and I wrote it was 12:45 a.m. I never dream at that time, ever.
Yeah.
It's usually early hours of the morning, like 3 a.m., 4, 5, 6. It says Greg was on the vent, sitting on a winding staircase about halfway up. That's where I wonder. Halfway up a staircase, you know, there's a scripture that talks about the stairway to heaven. And I walked in to check on him. Lisa had been checking on him prior and was resting. I was sitting on the step above Greg. He suddenly started to move, and I can see it right now, just like I had the dream, because he was all in white.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sitting, I can't see the front of him. So I looked down and watched him from behind, pulled the ventilator tube right out of his throat. He stood up, and I was hollering, Greg, wait! I was uncertain he was coherent and wanted to make sure he wasn't hurt. He got up and started walking around in what seemed to be a large house where the staircase was, and started calling, of course, Lisa. And it was such a scene for me, because I'm following him around, just wanting to make sure he's like okay, and he just has to find you. He don't care. He's looking for Lisa. We rounded the corner, and Lisa was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. I'll never forget that. Which a kitchen is a place of preparation. Greg ran right into her arms, and she was smiling. Her arms were wide open, and they embraced. Literally, like, I wish the people can't see this, but you had the biggest smile on your face in your arms, and he like totally ran into your arms. And I put at the end of the dream, it was like I witnessed a sudden deliverance, and he was absolutely fine.
Yeah.
I think I wrestled for an hour. I can't. I was like, it's 12:45 a.m. Do I text this to her right now? I mean, God, I never get these kind of dreams. But I was half scared to text it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You
Am I?
texted me that
It was like
morning.
6 or 6:30.
Yeah. Well, I think it was later than that.
Maybe.
Because I was sitting in the chapel. It was our Wednesday morning prayer time. And I was sitting in the chapel when you texted that to me. And I couldn't hardly read it. I was bawling. Because I said, I never thought I'd ever hear him say my name again.
And David had a dream the same
night.
night.
The same. He had texted me that morning. He had texted me his dream about 6:30 that morning.
Do you remember his dream?
I think I have it down here somewhere.
Wasn't it something about he came into the ministry building?
David was sitting in the cafeteria at the men's campus, and he turned around, and Greg was standing there, and he said, I just got up. He said, I just started bawling, and I went over and just hugged him, you know.
I mean, that was such, for me, the two dreams in the same night.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh. And
it was September 29th.
Okay.
September 29th. Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
David said, I had a dream last night. Greg came walking into the cafeteria at the men's center, and I turned around and started to hug him and started sobbing my eyeballs out.
Oh. And I think at that point, we were all like, yeah, he's going to heal him. He's coming out of this thing. Matter of fact, I even said, well, Lord, how literal is that? Is he literally going to pull his own tube out? I mean, seriously.
But you know what? Thinking about it, I mean, I'd have to go back and look calendar and all that kind of stuff. But when you say halfway up, I think about that was September 29th. It was, so he had been intubated 35 days.
Mm-hmm.
He was totally off the vent on the 58th day. So he was about
halfway.
That is about halfway.
That's interesting.
You know, and
yeah.
Yeah.
Halfway through. He was halfway through.
And girl, I have had so many people tell me, you know, strangers, you know, we went camping and met this husband and wife, and she's a nurse, and I, you know, just got to talking about Greg, and I said, you know, he was intubated. She said, oh, how long was he intubated? I said, 58 days, and she said, girl, he's a miracle. She said, because that does not happen. That does not happen.
Of course, he was a miracle. Do you remember any other specific times you felt like the Lord was sweetly talking to you, or anything else you can remember? Because he was evident. You were not alone.
No.
You were never alone. But I do know, you know, for those listening, I do know you were struggling in the separation. You are a very close couple.
Until that time, we had never been apart more than 2 weeks.
Yeah.
When he went on a missions trip to Vietnam several years ago. That was the first time we had ever been apart more than a week. Yeah. I mean, even when our son had his motorcycle wreck, you know, he was home every weekend, so he'd be gone 4 or 5 days, and he'd be home.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was, and then not to be able to even talk to him. And to have all of that, nobody could help me make decisions.
Right.
You know? I mean, even our kids, you know, I was trying, and here's my thing.
You're trying to shelter the kids.
I'm trying to shelter the kids.
Right.
They're adults, and they told me after everything was said and done, they were like, my daughter was like, Mom, we're adults. I said, I know that, but I said, I was just trying to not put this burden. I said, it was so overwhelming to me. I didn't want to make it overwhelming to you. I needed you to be there just for moral support, you know.
Right.
But I remember, I think the most painful part of this whole thing was right before, you know, the doctor had convinced me to trach him.
Okay.
And then in the meantime, they moved him to this other unit, and stuff just, it just, everything just went to a standstill. And during that time was when I went, to his room, and his eyes had no color in them, and other things were happening that I was seeing I was like, oh God, are his kidneys beginning to fail? Just because I could just see everything degrading in him during that time. But the Lord was still speaking. He was, it was right about that time you had the dream, and he was still speaking to me, and he was speaking through to other people that were calling me and telling me, or sending me scripture, sending me confirmation. It was God was never silent.
Right.
But in all of this, I saw him degrading. I saw him deteriorating. And I remember driving down the road just screaming at God, it's enough, I can't do this anymore. And still nothing would change. And I had a friend from Houston call me one day. She said, can I just come and visit you for a few days? And I was like, sure. And I'm thinking, oh, this will be great, it'll get my mind off of stuff. And she came, and she went with me, she would go with me to the hospital. I think she stayed 2 nights or something like that. Let me go visit him and, wait for me. And then right after that, she was leaving, and the next day my daughter was coming. And I was like, oh, great, bringing my granddaughter, oh, this will be great. And through all that, it got worse. And I remember I was watching my granddaughter play this one, I think this was like on Saturday. And it was just so, the weight was so heavy. I couldn't pray myself out of it.
Yeah.
I couldn't sing myself out of it. It didn't matter what I do, the heaviness, the depression, the despair.
Yeah.
Even knowing everything God had said,
Yeah.
the despair was so great. And I remember having to call my daughter and say, come watch Isla. And I had you on the phone.
Yeah.
And she said, are you okay? And I said, I'm fine. She was afraid something had happened.
Sure.
I said, no, I'm fine. I just need to vent. And so I, talked to you, and you prayed with me, and it was such a heaviness I could not shake. And all that night, and the next morning, I was going to go see him, and my daughter was leaving, and I remember sitting on my back patio before she had gotten up, and I said, God, I'm done.
Yeah.
And I said, when I go in that place today, because see, the whole time the bed sores were getting worse.
Right. Which was a big ordeal with the bed sores.
Big ordeal. It's getting worse. It's getting worse. It's not getting any better. And I'm like, they had already operated on him once, and they were still getting worse. And I sat there and I said, God, I'm done. I said, if I go in there today, and there is not something that tells me he's getting better. I don't mean getting better just for today.
Right.
I mean getting better. I said, I'm coming home, and I'm going to prepare to be a widow. I don't recommend anybody saying this. I know God knew that I was saying it out of such torment and such pain.
Yeah.
But I said, God, I'll always serve you, but I'll never believe another word you say.
Yeah.
Because you have spoken and you've given promises. And I said, I have yet to see anything except words.
Yeah.
You've given dreams and visions to me and to everybody else, but I'm yet to see the first inkling that any of it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And that was the most painful, the most fearful place I have ever been in my life, because I don't talk to God like that.
Yeah. But don't you think that was part, though, too, of God? You and I both know this innately. We preach this all the time. He knows already.
Yeah.
It's not like we're telling him something he doesn't know. But I think there's a beautiful intimacy in that we're brave enough to bring him that. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you could have never said it.
Yeah.
He still would have known you were thinking it.
Right.
But I think there's a measure of trust that we don't realize we have with God at times until we go with something that heavy, right?
Right.
And yet he doesn't turn away.
Yeah.
He still answers the plea.
Yeah.
You know?
And so I told him, I said, I will take this as evidence. When I walk in there, I want them to tell me that that bed sore's getting better.
Mm-hmm.
I said, and I will take that as proof. You know, here again, I'm asking God to prove himself to me, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll take that as proof that you are going to raise him up and he is going to live.
Yeah.
And so I walked in and the nurse had just come out of his room and she said, well, we just got through changing his wound bandage. And I said, oh, how is that? She said, oh, it's getting better. And that was it. And because that was all I'd asked for. Let them tell me it's getting better. You know? And from that...
They could have been doing 1,000 other things, but they were working on the bed sore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From that day, I think that's the day I had the meeting with the doctor. I think all that happened the same day. Or maybe it was the next day. But anyway, they had told me, they had let me know at some point in time that they were going to, because the COVID patients were, there weren't as many.
Mm-hmm.
They were closing this unit, you know. They had two sides, so they might either move him on the other side or move him to a different section of the hospital. And so I had everybody pray that he moves over here because that's where my friend.
I remember that.
Yeah,
yes.
That's where my friend worked. So the next day, I got a call, said, oh yeah, he's over in this unit. Well, he wasn't on the floor where my friend was. He was on a floor upstairs, and I was like, well, you know, that was and once I got in there, it was a big, beautiful room, and everybody was so caring and so attentive, and I'm like, this is, wow, this is, you know, this is awesome, because everybody else had just been like so standoffish, and didn't really get anybody to, you know, tired and wore out. And so anyway, my friend had came the next day or so, came to see him. She came upstairs, came to see him, and I said, she said, well, what time do you leave? And I said, well, I'm here all day long. She said, really? She said, they're letting you stay in here all day long? I said, nobody's said anything. I just come when I get ready to come, and I leave, you know. And she said, oh, on my floor, you can only stay an hour. See, God allowed him to go to a place where they weren't going to
say anything,
limit me.
Well, and the truth was, you had gone through that already.
Mm-hmm.
More than some others we knew who were allowed to stay. Well, they had rooms where they could stay.
Right.
Right. And they weren't limited on time as you were in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It's like God was repaying you.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But from that day, things started happening. The doctor that they had assigned to him, I just loved her. I mean, she was, you know, they had a lot of traveling doctors,
Right.
which was part of the thing, you know, because they're not from here, they don't get to know people,
Right.
you know.
And they don't stay.
And they don't stay.
Yeah.
But anyway, this doctor was just great. And the first day she walked in, she goes, because he had 2 chest tubes put in because he had fluid outside in the sac outside of his lungs, and so they had to put 2 chest tubes in. And she came in, she goes, well, this one's coming out. I was like, oh, okay, because I had been told when they put those things in that as long as he was on the ventilator, he was going to have the chest tube. And so she said, well, I'm going to pull this out. I said, I thought he had to be on that as long as he was on the ventilator. She says, oh no, popped it out, threw the thing in the trash. She said, now I'm going to leave this other one. It's still draining a little bit, you know. So I said, oh, okay, great, you know. So the next day she comes in, she goes, oh, well, this one's coming out. Boop. So she, you know, so 2 days in a row was eventful.
Progress,
you know,
yeah.
Progress. And she said, well, she said, they only do, he was still on the, you know, the tooth through his mouth. She said, they only do trachs on Wednesdays or Thursdays, whatever day it was. They only do them 1 day a week. And she said, I've already talked to the surgeon, and he's all booked up. So she said, I'm not sure if it's going to be done this week or it's going to be done next week. So just so you know. I said, okay, that's fine. The next morning, 9 o'clock, I get this phone call from the nurse. She said, I need your permission for them to put the trach in. I said, I thought they weren't going to do it this week. She said, I thought so too. She said, but I just got the order and I need your permission to do it. So it's like every single day something was
something
happening.
new, yeah.
So because that went so smoothly, I knew that the thing with the trach was in line with what God was doing, because it happened so fast. It wasn't even supposed to happen, and it was happening.
Yeah.
So the wheels were rolling. You know? And of course, as soon as he got the trach in, then he was able to go to this other unit in the hospital, which their mission statement basically is about when the person comes into their hospital. She said, we are focused on getting him out the door. She said, that's our priority. From the day that I had my meltdown with the Lord, stuff started happening every single day. It was a major move forward.
That's awesome. So how much time after that do you remember till he was able to come home?
It was about right at 2 months, because he stayed 1 month in the continued care part of the hospital, and they immediately began working on those bed sores. I mean, those two nurses, they were just awesome nurses, And he even, because he was coming out of sedation, so he kind of remembers some of that, There was this one lady, I never did get to hear her story, but she had one of her legs was entire prosthetic all the way up to the hip.
Okay.
And it was a leopard print.
No.
I mean, she was, you could see her walking down the hall. She comes prancing down, she had that leopard print, prosthetic leg. She was awesome. I just loved her to death. But he has told me, because I could never be in there when they were doing it. But he said they were having to do things quickly because rolling him over on his side would make his oxygen go down. So they would roll him over. He said she would climb up and straddle his legs and start working on that bed sore, because they were having to debride almost every day to get that thing.
Right. And
I remember standing out in the hallway with those two ladies and just crying. I'm like, I don't understand how it got to this point, and I was and they just hugged me and loved on me. They were just the sweetest. And so I remember one day after about a week, I caught one of them in the hall and I said, hey, how? She said, well, we just got through changing his dress, and they did it twice a week. And she said, it's pink. She said, it's pink and fluffy. She said, that is what we want. And he just started getting better. From then on, he started getting better. They were using new procedures on him, to help him heal up. And, one of them told me, she said, it's about 8 months is what you're looking at, for this thing to be totally closed up. And, they were pretty much right.
Pretty right. I remember getting the message from you that he only had to go one more time.
Yeah. And then we have a friend that deals with pharmaceutical grade supplements.
Okay.
Herbal supplements. And he had never even known Greg was in the hospital. People just kind of, I don't have phone numbers. Greg's phone was locked up the entire time he was in there, so I couldn't let people know. But he came through a couple of months ago, and he said, Greg, I had no idea. And so Greg was kind of telling him what had going on, and he said, he's got this, big scar, and he said, when I get back to my office, he was going to a conference. When I get back to my office, he said, I'm going to send you some stuff to put on this. And he did. And I mean, it had, because it had been real stiff, and it would, kind of open back up. He started using this, girl. I mean,
good to know.
Yeah. I mean, it's softened it,
Mhm.
so it's not, it's real pliable.
So
where
it
scar
doesn't just
tissue's always
break open.
Yeah,
Yeah.
scar tissue's always so fragile.
Mhm.
It's thickened it up and softened it.
Mhm.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's still, I believe God's going to totally heal his voice,
Yeah, and for the listener, so he's out of the hospital and back at work.
Yeah.
Right. So and Ann has I've been in the room when he's preached, and I've said to you, "Oh my gosh!" Every time he preaches, his voice sounds better.
Yeah.
I mean, I hear it more when I'm out in the audience,
Yeah.
and he gets on the mic, or even when he does it, and I'm like,
Yeah.
it sounds better every time.
There are times when we're at home and he'll be talking and I'm like,
Almost sounds normal.
almost sounds totally normal. I think when he has to project,
Yeah, it's harder.
then yeah.
Hmm.
But yeah, from that point, that is, I can tell you the day, I can tell you the time when I told the Lord I just couldn't do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That things just, it was constantly a move forward, just like I had told him. I said, I don't want to see a one and done. I want to see progress.
Right.
It has been progress ever since then.
And I remember you faithfully, and I don't know if he remembers any of this, you'd have to tell me, but I remember you going up there and constantly telling him everything, all the words of the Lord. Everybody was getting things God was telling you. You were constantly feeding him.
Yeah.
Stories, what God was doing, what God was saying, reading the Word. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I distinctly remember that.
Yeah. Well, and I just thought about this as kind of backtracking. Sorry.
That's okay.
But the week that he was intubated, I'm gonna read this word of the Lord, and you can share it or you can edit it out, but I'm gonna.
Did it come back then?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was. Greg was intubated on the 24th. On the 27th, about 12:30 in the morning, the Lord woke me up, and he just downloaded this word into me that, okay, this has never happened to me. It happens to other people all the time, but this was a new thing for me, because what prompted me even thinking was the day he was intubated, and you were in the room, and you began to pray, and you were praying for the Ruach.
Breath of God. That's right.
Breath of God. So when I woke up, that was the word I heard, was Ruach, life-giving breath of the living God. And so this is how I wrote it. God woke me at 12:45 a.m. on Friday the 27th with what he had wanted me to pray, to declare and to speak to Greg. The most powerful thing was the command that he was going to have me say, Greg Fleck, you breathe. It was not a choice, it was a command. And the word of the Lord was, my Ruach, my life-giving breath is here, breathe. It's the same breath that I breathed into Adam and he became a living soul. And Greg, you would say, but I'm on this ventilator, how can I breathe your breath? When have man's devices ever stopped me?
Amen.
You breathe, Greg Fleck. There is no other effort on your part. Breathe. I will do the rest. Who told you you were finished on this earth? You never heard those words come from me. Would I give you words to speak and not the opportunity to speak them? You're going to set your feet in places you've never thought possible. And speak my word to ears you never thought would listen. Yeah. You breathe, Greg Fleck. And I was talking to my cousin a few days ago and was telling her, how nurses and doctors have said you don't have any sound of COVID in your lungs. And she said, but Lisa, God told Greg to breathe.
Right.
He didn't have any choice. He has to breathe. And
that's good.
I think it was that next day, a friend of ours, she's kind of our spiritual daughter, she had texted me and she said, is there a specific way that I can pray? Because everybody knew that I went at 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Right,
to go see
right.
Greg. And I said, well, and I told her about this word. I mean, because this was, I had been to see him a couple of times. The first time I went in to see him, I could only stay 10 minutes. I couldn't stand to look at him like that.
Yeah.
And then the second time I went in there, and the doctor had just such discouraging words that I couldn't stay in there. I just, and so this was like the third time I was going in there. And God had given me this word, this strong, powerful word.
Mm-hmm.
And so I told her, I shared with her what it was, and she said, Lisa, she called me, she said, Lisa, I just saw a friend of mine. She said, we don't see each other very often, but I ran into her in a parking lot, and she said, I was telling her about Greg, and she said, the word that she used was ruach.
Mm.
The word that she used was breathe. She said actually the word was ephatha. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. It's an Aramaic word that Jesus spoke to a deaf man in Mark chapter 7 verse 31. He said ephatha, which means open up.
Mm.
But the voice it's written in, this was her point, the voice it was written in is commanding, and the word is understood to mean that it would be impossible to refuse the command.
Wow.
So the word that God was giving Greg to breathe was not a choice.
It was it was impossible for him to refuse.
Impossible for
I
him
love
to
it.
refuse. He had to breathe.
Wow.
And so I remember that day, because I knew I had this word, and I didn't want any distractions. I didn't want anybody stopping me in the hospital
Right.
and telling me something that was going to discourage me. I said, God, protect me from anybody that's going to come at me and give me a discouraging word. I need to be focused on this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I walked in and gowned up, was walking down the hall, and this little nurse, she'd been real sweet. I think she'd been his nurse the day before or something like that. And she stopped me, and I was like, God, don't let her discourage me. But she had this brightness in her face.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, I have to tell you. She said, the doctor looked at his x-rays this morning and says, oh my goodness, he looks so much better. His lungs are so much clearer. I grabbed that poor woman by the face. Thank you, Jesus. And her eyes got big as saucers when I did that. I said, I'm sorry. I'm not supposed to touch you. I apologize. I'm sorry.
That's precious.
But I went in there and I spoke that word to him, and I would go in there and I would repeat that word to him. Dreams, other words that other people, I would go in there and I said, I know you've heard me say this before. Of course, he was asleep. So I don't know. I said, I don't know how much you're remembering, so I'm repeating it to you again,
Right.
I'll just tell him over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole time he was in there, there's a chart app where you can see, the day-to-day of everything
Right.
they put in. You have access to their charts. I never had access to that. The whole time he was in the hospital, I never
That
had
was probably
access
the
to
Lord's
that.
protection.
I got access to that the day he went into the rehab hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Because I forget what was going on, and the guy said something about, well, you can see it on this app. I said, no, I never got access to it. Oh, well, here, let me send it to you. And I started reading this stuff. And I was like, God, you protected me, because I said I'd have lost it. Worse than I lost it.
Yeah.
If I'd have been reading this.
Right.
Where they were saying that he was sepsis.
Mm-hmm.
That's death.
Mm-hmm.
That was a death sentence. And everybody knows that. And I would have known it too.
Yeah.
How could I have kept my focus and my
Right.
faith
Right.
if I would have known that they were using that terminology?
Right.
But in all of that, victory, there's been a difficulty for both Greg and I. God, why did you save him?
Yeah.
Why not this one? I know God is sovereign. He knows our days. Our days are numbered before we ever start the first one.
And we talked about that a lot.
Yeah.
Because we had friends that didn't make it.
And friends that didn't make it. Multiple friends that didn't make it. I remember walking in the hospital one day, and there was 5 families in there that were saying goodbye to their loved ones, and one of the families I knew.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I shouldn't have come today. I should not have come today, because that was hard
Yeah.
to see all that, knowing that the next day could have been my turn.
So it's almost like y'all have had which he talked about it on his podcast,
Yeah,
a little bit of a survivor's remorse,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
And I've had the same thing. Not that I'm the survivor, but it's been really, really hard. I mean, we had one of our former students. Her mom went in after Greg did, and didn't survive.
Mm.
And she didn't talk to me for a while. She finally came back and texted, because she would text me and ask me how he was doing, and she would give me updates on my mom. And she, after a couple of weeks, she finally said, "I'm sorry, I just couldn't." I said, "No, girl, I totally understand." I said, "I haven't wanted to text you because my husband's still alive."
Yeah.
No, he's not more important than anyone else.
I was just fixing to say, yeah.
You say, "Oh well, he heads up the ministry." That doesn't matter. That's not.
Yeah, he doesn't love anybody more than the next, and there is just, maybe it's one of those things, Lisa, we've talked about this, where you just don't have the answer.
Yeah.
I mean, we just don't have the answer to this. Like you said, the word does say, all my days are written before I was one day old. So God knows the day. There's a scripture that says, it is, given a man unto, what is that scripture? A time to die.
Uh-huh.
We know Ecclesiastes 3 says there's a time to live and a time to die. None of us know when our day is up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like we planned for it, but it could be tomorrow, tonight. I mean, so yeah, it's been hard to have those conversations, but all you can do is go, well, God's not done here yet, and Lord, and steward well the time, right? Because you can't go forward with guilt or or even the devil trying to say don't share the story. Right.
Well, that even kind of crossed my mind a week or so ago. I'm like, how am I going to get on there and say, look at the victory I had, my husband survived, and I've got multiple friends that didn't, and
it's hard.
It is. It's hard. I mean, I'm always trying to choose my words very carefully, when I talk to one of them, because my God, the pain they have, I don't want to inflict more.
Right.
But I do know that you still answer prayer.
Absolutely. And he's still at work. And he still has a plan in place. Even through loss. Yeah. There's still something. He's still involved. Well.
But here's the thing: is even though Greg did survive, I went through some of the same things last year of people who actually did lose their loved one. I went through the same. I mean, it's not exactly the same, true, because he did survive, but there was a time when I felt like he wasn't. And so during that time, I went through almost a type of a
loss.
mourning,
Oh, you definitely were going through a mourning of life as what was normal. The mourning of the unexpected and not knowing what each day held. And you and I have talked about this even this morning, and Greg mentioned it, because I said it's a little PTSD-ish in nature of, because even when he came home, and even, y'all both healing, you're still in a process of healing, right? There's still, I remember when I had, the Lord had given me a song in time for a mutual friend who didn't make it. And before I released it, I sent it to you, and you said, I need it now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I realized in that moment, I think I had not realized you were still dealing with some of the emotions. You know, even, I mean, is it fair to say that even though God was talking, there are thoughts of like you've been abandoned or left behind or isolated?
Yeah.
And why? I mean, we're all human.
Yeah.
We all ask those questions. So I think, you know, the song pulled some of that out,
Yeah.
you know, and even now maybe y'all still are in a deep healing process. Yet we know, I mean, I said to you when you came in, one of the beautiful things that came out of it was our relationship.
Yeah.
God was very kind, you know, in letting me have a new friend and see you up close and personal, not just always from the work you do, you know, and honor to walk with you through that, but also just there was some kind of bond in the spirit that I don't know that I still understand.
Yeah.
Just something God was doing. And we see that now in worship. We see that we all get to be together in that. Anything else you want to? There's all kinds of trauma people are going through. Some will listen and have gone through this in other ways, but anything else you can think of you'd want to share? You certainly could never have made that without Jesus.
Oh, never. But it gave me an understanding. In fact, you know, the work that we do, you know, we deal with people that have had addictions and other issues. And I never did. You know, I've never even smoked a cigarette. So I've never had, you know, an addiction to anything. So I've always questioned God, why am I doing what I'm doing when I have no basis for comparison to anything these people are walking through?
You've said that before.
And but there was during that period of time when it would just be so devastating, and I came to understand why people medicate.
Yeah.
Because the pain was so horrendous. I would have given, because like I said, I couldn't pray myself out of it. I couldn't sing myself out of it. I would call 4 people to pray for me for the same thing and not get any relief.
Right.
There was such a darkness over me. I could not climb out of it. And I came to the realization one day that is why some people go to that.
Right. Because they can't take it anymore.
Because the pain is so great, they cannot deal with it anymore. That's just not my nature, but that's just not something that I guess I would be prone to do, is to go medicate to get, you know. But I understood. Finally, I understood because the when we walk people through deliverance, you know, I'm like, oh my gosh, the trauma, you know, from the trauma over and over and over again, and I'm like, that's now I understand. Now I understand.
Yeah.
And I've had to walk with friends since then that have lost deeply. And even though I did not lose deeply, I understand where they're at.
Yeah.
You know, when they're responding or reacting, or they don't even know themselves, why am I being this way? And because I went through it, I can say, this is why this is why you're responding. This is why you're feeling this now. You know, so God has used it.
Yeah.
You know, to help other people.
Well, and don't you think? I think we all realize at this point that some of that is preparation for something coming.
Right.
Right. Whatever that is,
Whatever
who knows? But it seems like there was a newfound strength.
Yeah.
Even through the grief of it all, or the why did we have to go through that? In you, that line of Judah standing up in you, but in Greg too, of, you know. And I didn't know him very well before all of this, really.
Yeah, right.
But I've seen, even in worship, such a longing and a hunger to absolutely be led by the Spirit.
Oh, yeah.
Like a newfound, it feels, and I don't know that I can even say this because I didn't know how he was before, but I sense a newfound desire. You know what I'm saying? Which has been precious. So.
And, you know, we knew that God was taking us. You know, our ministry is always going to do what it does, but as far as our, you know, chapel services, our worship,
Right.
we knew God was taking us in unfounded territory. even early last year, you know. And I knew from the start, when Greg had to go in the hospital, I knew this was not just a physical attack.
Right.
That this was a spiritual attack.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter.
Absolutely.
And so I remember, you know, just one day when, you know, I had just had enough. I had had enough of the enemy. I'd had enough of what he was trying to pull, you know, and I'm like, I see what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I know what you're doing. And I'm like, devil, we're not turning back.
Mm-hmm.
We're not stepping back. We're not sitting down.
Mm-hmm.
We're not pulling back.
Mm-hmm.
We're going forward, no matter what.
Yeah.
You know.
That's what it comes down to, doesn't it?
And did it get harder after that? Yeah. It got harder after that. You know. I think, you know, I time-wise, I don't remember everything, but I'm thinking that's when the oppression of my mind got worse.
Sure.
You know,
like a torment.
Like a torment, because the enemy couldn't kill Greg. He was off limits. But he could torment me, you know, in my mind.
Yeah.
You know. So, but like I said, God was so vocal. Never more than a couple of days, you know, would pass before there was a new fresh word or something or confirmation. I had one day when I was just really, I think I called you, I called everybody, there was just no relief, and I'm like, I'm wearing my friends out. And I reached out to a cousin of mine that, you know, we hadn't seen each other in a long time. We correspond very seldom. She and her husband pastor a church, you know, and they're busy. But I texted her, and don't even know why to this day. I texted her, and I said, I really need your prayer, this is what's going on. And she came back, she said, oh, Lee, she said, I'm so sorry. She said, I thought he had gotten out of the hospital. I'm like, no, you know. And so she called me, and she prayed for me, and I was like, boom, immediately it broke. And so after that, we started corresponding back and forth. She would text me, and women in her church, because they put it out on their prayer list, and women in her church I remember she sent me, I forget what, I think it was Psalms 31, Psalms 13, I can't remember, I'd have to look it up. She sent this to me. Well, she told, and then she sent later on, she said, this lady that's on our prayer sent me, and it was the same scripture. And then somebody else sent her the same scripture that day, you know, and it was, you know, it was all just confirmation. Just boom, 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 all the time. I was getting, you know, words from her, dreams, visions, people were seeing, but never even laid eyes on either one of us.
Amen. Amen. We were bound in the Spirit.
Yeah.
Totally. If the listeners don't get anything else from this story, they will know God still speaks.
Yes.
Because I still hear that today. What do you mean God speaks? Well, he says, my sheep hear my voice. You know? And that even whether we're on mountaintops, which we prefer, or in the valleys, he still speaks today to his sheep. So we're never left. We're never forsaken. Doesn't mean we've missed the trials. You and I know we've seen a lot of trials. But God still speaks today. one of the biggest morals of this story. God speaks. He sure does.
And you know, like he said to me this morning, just give me glory.
Yeah.
Just glorify my name.
Yeah.
You know? And he used so many people during this process. So one person would get the glory? No.
Exactly.
So he would get it.
That's right.
And nobody could deny that it was him.
Right.
We hope today's episode has blessed you and encouraged you to pursue Christ passionately. To join us again for more encouragement, equipping, and empowering, subscribe to the 320 Podcast. We would also like to invite you to enjoy our round-the-clock radio station, Royalty for Real Radio for Women, at royaltyforreal.com. That's royalty, the number 4, real.com.